My wife threw her wedding ring at me in front of her lover and friends. Humiliating me. I never thought my marriage would end like this. My wife threw her wedding ring at me in front of her lover and her so-called friends. Humiliating me beyond anything I've ever experienced. But what happens when a quiet, hard-working man decides he's had enough? What happens when I take control and fight back? You won't believe where this story goes. Keep watching to find out how I turn the tables on the lies that almost destroyed me. It's funny how much you can miss the simple things like the way sunlight spills through the blinds in the morning, the sound of your wife humming in the kitchen while the coffee brews, or the quiet conversations before you both drift off to sleep. I used to think those little moments would last forever. I never imagined I'd find myself sitting alone in this tiny Austin apartment, staring into a cold cup of coffee, trying to make sense of where it all went wrong. Everything about this place felt different now. The peeling paint on the walls, the mismatched furniture we once joked about replacing it all seemed to mirror the decay in my marriage. And yet, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop myself from going back to the beginning. To the days when Marnie and I were happy, when she wasn't just my wife but my best friend, my partner in everything. Marnie was a whirlwind when I first met her. She had this way of lighting up a room without even trying. Her laughter was infectious, her energy boundless. She'd breeze into my life with that bright smile, and take every bit of the darkness with her. I was hooked from the start. We didn't have much back then, just a couple of 20-somethings barely scraping by in a city that seemed to chew people up and spit them out. But it didn't matter. We had each other, and that was enough. Marnie made me feel like we could take on the world together. She made me believe that, no matter how tough things got, we'd come out stronger on the other side. It wasn't just love, it was a partnership. A promise we made to each other. We'd save up for a little house, start a family, build a life that wasn't glamorous but was ours. I remember sitting on the balcony of our first apartment, planning it all out. She'd talk about the little garden she wanted, the dog we'd get, the road trips we'd take once we could afford a car that wouldn't break down every 100 miles. I'd sit there listening to her, soaking in her excitement, and thinking that as long as I had her by my side, I'd do whatever it took to make those dreams come true. For years, that's exactly what I did. I worked long hours at a marketing firm that barely paid the bills, picked up side gigs to keep us afloat, even sold off my guitar, one of the few things I'd kept from my college days, just to make ends meet. I didn't mind. Not really. Every sacrifice felt worth it because it was for us. It was for the life we were building together. I still remember the day we finally got the keys to our first real home. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest 2-bedroom in an older neighborhood. But to us, it was a palace. I carried her over the threshold like I'd seen in all those corny movies, and she laughed. That bright, beautiful laugh that made everything seem possible. At first, everything seemed perfect. We started fixing the place up little by little: new paint, some second-hand furniture, small upgrades whenever we could afford them. We'd spend weekends at the hardware store, poring over paint swatches and tile samples, dreaming about what the place could become. And for a while, it felt like we were on the same page, like we were still that unstoppable team. But as time went on, something started to shift. At first, it was subtle comments here and there about wanting a bigger kitchen, a nicer living room, better appliances. I figured it was normal. Who doesn't want to improve their home? But the more we upgraded, the more it seemed like Marnie's vision of our life was changing, drifting away from the simple dream we once shared. Before I knew it, she was talking about hosting dinner parties, about turning our modest home into something out of a lifestyle magazine. I couldn't understand it. We had what we needed, didn't we? A roof over our heads, food on the table, each other. That was supposed to be enough. But for Marnie, it wasn't. I'll never forget the first time she mentioned upgrading our entire kitchen. "It'll be worth it," she said. "We deserve it." And so, I worked more. I took on extra freelance projects, spent long nights at my desk, all to make sure we could afford the renovations. I told myself it was just a phase, that once we finished the upgrades, we'd get back to the life we had planned. But deep down, I started to worry. The renovations were beautiful. I'll admit that. New marble countertops, high-end appliances, designer fixtures. Our house looked like something out of a TV show. But it didn't feel like home anymore. The warmth, the simplicity, the sense of belonging I once felt in those walls was gone. The home we'd built together had become something else entirely. Marnie's dream, not mine. I didn't say anything. I just kept working, kept telling myself that it was all for us. But the more I gave, the more I saw her slipping away. The parties started soon after. Marnie was in her element, mingling with her new friends, laughing and smiling as though she had been born into that world of wealth and luxury. I'd stand at the edge of the room, clutching a glass of cheap wine I'd bought on sale, watching her glide through the crowd. She was magnetic, the center of attention. And me? I was just a shadow, a fixture in the background, the guy who worked late and paid the bills. I couldn't understand what had happened to us. I thought if I just worked harder, if I just gave her what she wanted, things would go back to the way they were. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment I realized I was losing her. Maybe it was when I overheard her talking to one of her friends, saying how she couldn't live in mediocrity forever. Maybe it was the way she started pulling away from me, barely acknowledging the small gestures I used to do to make her smile. Or maybe it was the way she smiled at someone else, a man, whose name I didn't know at the time, but would come to know all too well. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overthinking it, but the pit in my stomach said otherwise. I wanted to confront her, to ask what was happening, but I couldn't find the words. I was afraid of what she might say, afraid of hearing her admit that I wasn't enough for her anymore. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and I found myself more and more alone. I'd wake up early, get ready for work in silence, and come home to an empty house that felt colder with each passing day. Marnie's laughter, once so full of life, had become something distant, something that belonged to another world, a world I was no longer a part of. I started to dread the weekends, knowing she'd be hosting another party or meeting friends at some expensive restaurant. I told myself it was temporary, that things would settle down, but deep down, I knew the truth. Our dream was gone, and I was just a man clinging to the fragments of what once was. So here I am, sitting in this little apartment in downtown Austin, staring into a cold cup of coffee, wondering how it all fell apart, wondering if I could have done something differently. I still see her smile in my mind sometimes, the smile that used to make everything else fade away. But now, it's just a reminder of the life I thought we were building together, and the woman I thought I knew. Maybe I'll never understand what changed, why she drifted so far away. But one thing's for sure, the Marnie I fell in love with is gone. And so is the life we were supposed to share. It all started with little things I tried to ignore. A comment here, a glance there. At first, I told myself it was just the stress of life, everyone wants something better, right? We'd been through plenty of hard times before. And we'd always come out on the other side. I kept saying it would be okay, that it was just a rough patch. But deep down, I knew something was different. The nights we used to spend talking about our dreams were replaced with silence. When I asked her about her day, she'd wave me off or give me a short, distant answer. I started to notice the way she'd pick up her phone mid-conversation, smiling at some text message I wasn't a part of. I told myself I was imagining it, but the pit in my stomach said otherwise. One night, I overheard her on the phone. She thought I was asleep, but the walls in our place were thin. "I can't keep living like this," she said. "He doesn't see it. He's fine staying exactly where we are, but I'm not. I need more." Her voice was sharp, filled with a frustration I didn't recognize. My chest tightened. I wanted to burst into the room and ask her what she meant, why she felt that way, why she couldn't tell me, but I didn't. I stayed there, frozen, heart pounding. I hoped that if I stayed quiet, maybe it would go away. Maybe it was just a moment of doubt. But that was the first crack I couldn't ignore. After that, things only got worse. She started going out more. At first, it was the occasional happy hour with friends. Then it was dinners, then weekend events I wasn't invited to. When I'd ask who she was meeting, she'd smile and say it was just some old colleagues or friends from yoga. I wanted to believe her. I wanted so badly to trust her. But something in the way she said it, the way she avoided my eyes, made my stomach churn. I began to notice the small changes: new clothes she didn't used to wear, a perfume I'd never smelled before. She was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. Then one evening, I came home after a long day at work. The house was empty, but I could hear laughter from outside. I walked into the backyard and saw her there, surrounded by a group of people I didn't recognize. She was hosting a party, but she hadn't mentioned a word about it to me. I stood there for a moment, feeling like a stranger in my own home. She caught my eye and hesitated for just a split second before coming over. "Oh, I meant to tell you," she said with a forced smile. "A few friends wanted to see the house. I didn't think you'd mind." I nodded, not wanting to cause a scene in front of all these people. But that night, after everyone had gone, I finally asked her what was going on. She shrugged it off, said it was nothing. "You're overthinking it," she said. But I wasn't. I knew something had changed, and I was too scared to face what it might mean. It wasn't long before I heard the name Cyrus for the first time. I didn't think much of it at first. She mentioned him casually, said he was someone she met through work connections. But then his name started coming up more often. She'd laugh at his jokes, talk about how smart and successful he was. I tried to play it cool, pretending I wasn't bothered. But every time she said his name, it felt like a jab to my gut. I couldn't help but wonder who this guy really was, and why he was suddenly so important to her. One evening, she invited him over for dinner. She told me it was just a business thing, that he wanted to discuss some investment opportunities. I spent the entire night feeling like a third wheel in my own home. They laughed at jokes I didn't understand, exchanged knowing looks I couldn't decipher. I tried to join in, but it was clear I wasn't part of their world. After Cyrus left, I asked her if there was something going on. She rolled her eyes. "Don't be ridiculous," she said. "He's just a friend." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But something inside me was screaming that this was more than friendship. The turning point came one weekend when I was supposed to be out of town for work. My trip was canceled last minute, and I didn't bother calling her because I thought I'd surprise her. When I walked into the house, I heard voices in the living room. Her laughter rang out, bright and carefree, followed by Cyrus's deep, confident tone. I froze. I didn't want to believe it. I peeked around the corner and saw them sitting close, her hand resting on his arm as they talked. The way she looked at him, it was a look I hadn't seen from her in years. My heart sank. I stepped back before they saw me, my mind racing. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to storm in, to confront her, to demand answers. But I didn't. I walked out of the house and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, my chest heaving. I kept asking myself how we'd gotten to this point. Was it my fault? Had I not done enough? But no matter how much I blamed myself, I couldn't shake the image of them together. I knew then that the woman I loved, the woman I thought I knew, was gone. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. I noticed how she'd spend more time getting ready before leaving the house. I saw the way her phone would light up with his name, how she'd smile at the screen before tucking it away. She was careful, never letting it get too obvious, but I wasn't blind. I started looking at our finances, checking the joint account statements. That's when I found the charges: expensive dinners at places I'd never been to, gifts I hadn't bought. My heart sank even further. She was using our money to fund her new life, a life I wasn't a part of. It was like a punch to the gut. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and completely powerless. Then came the night I'll never forget. She was hosting another party, and I knew Cyrus would be there. I didn't want to go, but something inside me told me I needed to see it for myself. I stood in the corner of the room, watching her laugh, watching her shine in a way that made it clear I no longer had a place in her world. I don't know what pushed her over the edge, but at some point, she turned to me, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You know what's the problem, Eliane?" she said, her face flushed. "You're fine with mediocre. You're fine staying stuck. I can't live like that anymore." And then, right there, in front of all her friends, in front of him, she pulled off her wedding ring and threw it at me. The room went silent. I could feel all eyes on me, feel the heat rising in my face. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I bent down, picked up the ring, and held it in my hand. I looked at her, the woman I had once promised to spend my life with, and realized she wasn't the same person anymore. I felt anger, sure. I felt sadness. But most of all, I felt empty. Without saying a word, I put the ring in my pocket and walked out of that room. Out of that house. Out of that life. I drove around for hours that night, my mind racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I thought about the years I'd given her, the sacrifices I'd made. I thought about all the times I told myself it would be okay, that things would get better. But they hadn't. I had loved her more than anything, and now it was clear that love wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. And in that moment, as the city lights blurred past, I realized I had a choice to make. I could keep chasing after someone who didn't want me, keep sacrificing everything for a dream that was no longer mine, or I could take back control. I didn't know what that looked like yet, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: determination. She had thrown away everything we had, but I wasn't going to let her take the rest of me with her. You won't believe what she did next. After years of hiding the truth, I finally uncovered her secret. So here's the question: will one confront her head on, or will I take a smarter, more calculated approach? Comment 1 if you think I'll go straight to her. And comment 2 if you think I have a more cunning plan in mind. It started slowly. The doubts that had been gnawing at me for months finally began to make sense. Late one night, when the house was silent and I was left alone with my thoughts, I found myself sitting in the dark at the kitchen table, my laptop glowing faintly in front of me. I knew something wasn't right, but up until that point, I had been too scared to look too closely. I kept telling myself that maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe I was reading into things that weren't there. But now I couldn't avoid it any longer. Marnie's behavior had changed too much, and those expensive dinners and random charges on the joint account couldn't be ignored any longer. So I started digging. I told myself I just wanted to understand. But deep down, I knew that once I opened that door, there was no closing it. The first thing I did was pull up our bank statements. I knew the logins by heart after all. I'd always been the one who handled our finances. I remember my hands shaking as I typed in the password, a tight knot forming in my stomach. I clicked through the months, scrolling past the usual charges for groceries, utility bills, the occasional repair for the car. Then, I saw them. Dinners at places I'd never heard of, nights out at upscale cocktail bars, expensive gifts I hadn't bought. At first, I thought maybe I was mistaken. Maybe she'd told me about these things and I'd just forgotten. But the more I looked, the more obvious it became. These weren't just random splurges. They were deliberate. They were calculated. They were done behind my back. I started printing everything out. Receipts, transaction histories, emails. I needed to see it all in front of me, to piece it all together. The evidence was overwhelming. I found tickets for events I never knew she attended. Items from luxury stores we'd never stepped foot in together. I remember staring at a receipt for a watch that cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. She had told me we needed to tighten our budget, to put off a vacation we'd been planning for years. Yet here she was, living a life I wasn't a part of, spending money I had worked so hard to save. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat there, surrounded by printouts and highlighted statements, my mind racing. Who was she really? Who was this person I'd shared my life with all these years? I thought I knew her. I thought I could trust her. But it was like looking at a stranger's account. Every transaction, every dollar spent without my knowledge felt like a betrayal. It wasn't just the money. It was the fact that she didn't think I deserved to know. The woman who used to talk to me about everything, who used to share her dreams with me, had shut me out completely. And now she was building a life that had no place for me in it. It wasn't just the financial records. I started paying more attention to her social media accounts, something I'd never really done before. I found photos of her at rooftop parties I hadn't known about, smiling with people I'd never met. She was tagged in posts from friends whose names I didn't recognize, standing beside Cyrus, that same guy I'd suspected all along. The captions made it all too clear. The best night ever. Living my best life. Each one felt like a slap in the face. She wasn't just hiding things, she was flaunting them. And I had been too blind, too trusting to see it. I couldn't stop myself from going deeper. I started looking through old emails, searching for patterns, for anything that might explain how we'd ended up here. I found messages she'd forwarded from Cyrus about investment opportunities, threads discussing trips I didn't know she had taken. It was all right there, hiding in plain sight, and I had been too busy working, too busy sacrificing, to notice. That realization hit me like a freight train. While I was pulling late nights and skipping vacations to pay for our future, she was using that money to fund her own private life. She was building something that had nothing to do with me. I remember sitting there at dawn, staring out the window as the sun rose, a pile of evidence scattered on the table. I should have felt angry. I should have felt betrayed. And I did, to some degree. But mostly, I felt numb. I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that the woman I loved, the woman I had married, had been lying to me for so long. It wasn't just one lie. It was layer upon layer, woven so intricately that it had taken me months to unravel. Every moment I thought back on, every smile, every laugh, it all felt tainted now. How much of it had been real? How much had been an act? I thought about all the times I had told myself things would get better, all the times I had pushed down my suspicions, because I didn't want to be the guy who doubted his wife. And now here I was, drowning in proof that she had never been honest with me. That day, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her right away. I wasn't ready for that. I needed time to figure out what to do next, how to protect myself. I opened a new bank account, something I hadn't done in years. It felt strange, almost surreal, setting it up. I felt like a different person. This wasn't the Elian who trusted too easily, who always believed in the best of people. This was someone new, someone who had learned the hard way that trust isn't always enough. I started transferring small amounts of money into that account, just enough to give me some breathing room. I didn't know what my next move was going to be, but I knew I needed to be prepared. I wasn't going to let her drain me dry, not anymore. I wasn't going to let her keep using me as a stepping stone for her new life. It was time to start taking back control, one step at a time. I didn't have a roadmap. I had no idea what I was doing. All I knew was that I needed a plan. I needed something that would keep me moving forward, a way to protect myself from whatever came next. As I sat there in that tiny apartment, staring at a laptop full of evidence and a pile of receipts on the table, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. I didn't even know where to start. Should I confront her now, lay it all out, and demand an explanation? Or would that just give her a chance to spin another story, another excuse that would leave me more confused than ever? I wasn't ready to face her yet. I wasn't ready to hear her lies, her attempts to justify what she'd done. I needed more than just anger. I needed control. So I took a deep breath and began to organize everything. I created folders on my computer, labeled them with dates and descriptions, bank statements, credit card charges, emails, social media screenshots. I didn't know if I'd ever need to show them to anyone, but I wanted them ready just in case. As I went through the emails again, I found more messages from Cyrus, more conversations that made it painfully clear. This wasn't just a casual acquaintance. He wasn't just a friend. He was the one she was confiding in, the one she was building a future with. And here I was, the fool sitting in the shadows, working myself to the bone to keep her happy. I started thinking about all the money I'd poured into our life together, all those extra shifts I picked up, the freelance gigs that kept me up until 3 a.m., the side jobs on weekends that left me too exhausted to even enjoy what little free time I had. I did it all for her. I thought we were building something real, something that would last. But now I realized I was just a stepping stone. She'd used me to create the image of the life she wanted, and when that image no longer included me, she moved on. The anger was there, sure, but so was the hurt. The deep, gnawing ache of betrayal that kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my mind, wondering how I could have been so blind. That's when I made the first real move. I opened a separate bank account. I'd never done anything like that before. Our finances had always been shared. It felt strange, almost like I was betraying her in some way. But then I reminded myself that she had already betrayed me. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting even. It was about survival. I knew that if I didn't take control now, I'd be left with nothing when the dust finally settled. I started small, transferring tiny amounts of money into the new account every week. Just enough to create a safety net, to give me a sense of security I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I started tracking her spending more closely. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't want her to know I was watching. But every time she used the credit card, every time she withdrew cash from our joint account, I made a note of it. I kept a spreadsheet that detailed every dollar she spent, every charge that didn't add up. It was painstaking work, and it felt like I was spying on her. But I needed to know. I needed to see the full picture of what she was doing, how far this had gone. The more I dug, the more I found. Trips I didn't know about. Gifts she had bought. Dinners at places I couldn't afford. The pattern was clear. She was living a life I wasn't part of, and she was using my money to do it. I didn't just stop at the finances. I started watching her behavior more closely. The way she'd smile at her phone. The way she'd leave the room to take calls. The excuses she gave when she was gone all day. I knew now that I wasn't imagining things. The gut feeling I'd been ignoring for months was right. She was hiding something, and every move she made confirmed it. I wasn't sure what my next step would be, but I knew I couldn't confront her yet. I needed to be patient, to wait for the right moment. I couldn't let my emotions get the better of me. I had to stay calm, stay focused. As the weeks went on, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I was still hurt, still angry, but I wasn't as scared anymore. I knew what I was dealing with now, and that gave me a sense of control. I hadn't felt in months. I started looking into my legal options, reading up on how to protect myself financially if this turned into a divorce. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not friends, not family. I didn't want anyone to talk me out of it or tell me I was overreacting. This was something I had to handle on my own. Every night, after she went to bed, I'd sit at the kitchen table and go over everything again. I'd double-check the account balances, update my spreadsheet, and make notes on anything new I'd found. It became a ritual, something that gave me a sense of purpose. For so long, I'd been working to build a life with her, and now that life was crumbling, but at least now I had something to focus on. A way to take back control piece by piece. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. I don't know when I'll be ready to confront her. I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I do know that when the time comes, I'll have everything I need. I'll be prepared. And for the first time in a long time, I'll be the one in control. I don't know when exactly I reached my breaking point. There wasn't one single moment, no dramatic line I could draw in the sand and say, this is when I couldn't take it anymore. It was a slow build, like a storm gathering on the horizon. I knew it was coming. I could feel it. Every little thing she did. Every half-truth, every unexplained night out, every hollow laugh when I asked if she was okay, it all piled up, brick by brick, until the weight was unbearable. I started seeing Cyrus's name pop up more often. Her friends talked about him casually, like he'd always been around. Oh, Cyrus mentioned this the other day. Or Cyrus had the funniest story about that place you guys went to. I wanted to scream. To tell them that I didn't know Cyrus had become a fixture in her life. To them, it was normal. To me, it was another reminder that I was being edged out of my own marriage. I'd sit in our living room, the same place we'd spent so many evenings together, and look at the changes she'd made. The new furniture, the expensive decorations, the sleek, modern feel of a house that no longer felt like home. She'd told me it was for us, that it would make things better, but all I saw was a stage for her new life. The life that didn't include me. Every time I tried to talk about it, to bring up how distant she seemed, she brushed me off. You're imagining things, she'd say, we're fine. But we weren't fine. I could see it in the way she barely looked at me. The way her attention was always somewhere else. I started to feel like a ghost, like I was haunting a house that had once been my own. The evenings were the hardest. She'd come home late, smelling a perfume I didn't recognize. When I asked where she'd been, her answers were vague. Just out with friends. I stopped pressing. The few times I did push for more details, she'd turn it around on me. Why are you being so paranoid? She'd ask. Don't you trust me? Those words cut deep, because I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe that I was wrong, that she wasn't pulling away from me. But everything about her screamed that she was no longer mine. One night, I came home to find a delivery on our doorstep. It was a package addressed to her. I brought it inside, thinking it was something she'd ordered online. But when I set it on the counter, I noticed the return address. It was from a jewelry store. I wasn't proud of what I did next, but I couldn't help myself. I opened it. Inside was a bracelet, simple but elegant, with a small note tucked beside it. The note wasn't from me. Looking forward to Friday, it read, signed with just the letter C. My heart sank. I stood there holding the note, my hands shaking. I didn't confront her that night. I put everything back exactly the way I found it, resealing the package and leaving it on the counter. But I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that my suspicions were no longer just paranoia. They were real. The next day, I started to notice all the little signs I'd missed before. The way she'd glance at her phone and smile when she thought I wasn't looking. The way she'd quickly close her laptop when I walked into the room. I didn't say anything. I didn't let her see that I was watching. But inside, I was boiling. I wasn't angry in the way I thought I'd be. I wasn't screaming or throwing things. It was a cold, steady rage that built up over time. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. I needed more than just a bracelet and a note. I needed proof. Proof she couldn't deny, couldn't explain away. I started keeping track of her schedule. When she left the house, when she came home, what excuses she gave. I didn't have a plan beyond that. I just knew that the more I saw, the more pieces I collected, the more certain I became of what was happening. I didn't follow her. I wasn't that kind of person. But I didn't have to. Her behavior was all the confirmation I needed. She'd smile at me less. She'd avoid my touch. She stopped asking me about my day, stopped sharing hers. We weren't partners anymore. We were just two people living in the same space, pretending everything was fine. The nights when she was gone were the worst. I'd sit alone in that cold, empty house, wondering where she was, who she was with. I tried not to imagine them together. I tried to push those thoughts out of my head, but they crept in anyway. I hated myself for still loving her, for still wanting things to go back to the way they were. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't just turn it off. I thought about all the years we'd spent building a life together, all the promises we'd made. And now, it felt like she was throwing it all away for someone else. As time went on, I realized I wasn't just angry at her. I was angry at myself. I was angry that I'd let it get this far, that I'd ignored the warning signs, that I'd made so many excuses for her behavior. I'd convinced myself that if I just worked harder, if I just did more, she'd come back to me. But it wasn't about me. It never had been. She'd made her choice, and no matter how much I wanted to fight for us, I couldn't fight alone. I remember the moment it hit me that I couldn't keep living like this. It was a Sunday evening. She'd left that morning saying she was meeting a friend for brunch. She didn't come home until after midnight. I sat on the couch in the dark, listening to the clock tick, watching the shadows move across the walls. When she finally walked through the door, she didn't even look at me. She just said, "Hey," and went straight to the bedroom. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty space she'd left behind. That's when I knew. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep hoping she'd come back to me. Something had to change, and it had to start with me. From that night on, I started to think differently. I started to focus on what I could do, what steps I needed to take to protect myself. I wasn't going to wait for her to leave me completely. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for her to decide my future. I had to take control, no matter how much it hurt. It's strange how quickly you get used to living with a lie. The more I knew, the more I uncovered, the less surprised I felt. It wasn't even a shock anymore, it was just confirmation of what I'd already come to suspect. But that didn't make it hurt any less. Every time I found another charge on the credit card, another text I wasn't supposed to see, another night she worked late, it chipped away at what little was left of the trust I had in her. I had always believed that if you loved someone, you gave them the benefit of the doubt. You assumed the best, even when things didn't add up. But now, looking back, I realized that I'd been a fool. She wasn't the woman I thought she was, and I couldn't keep pretending that our marriage was still worth fighting for. I started spending more time at work, not because I needed the money I knew she'd just spend it, but because I couldn't bear to be at home. The house felt like a museum to our past, filled with relics of a life that no longer existed. Every photo on the wall, every piece of furniture we'd picked out together, every little detail reminded me of what we'd had before everything fell apart. And now, those same things felt hollow, like props on a stage where I no longer had a role. I hated the silence, the way the walls seemed to close in on me when she wasn't there. But I hated it even more when she was home, and I could feel the distance between us like a chasm. She wouldn't look at me, wouldn't touch me, wouldn't talk about anything that mattered. It was like I didn't exist. At work, I threw myself into projects, staying late to avoid coming home to the emptiness. My colleagues probably thought I was just dedicated, maybe even trying to get a promotion. I didn't correct them. I let them believe I was climbing the ladder, working toward a better future. They didn't need to know that my dedication was really just desperation, a way to escape the reality waiting for me at home. I'd sit at my desk long after everyone else had left, staring at the spreadsheets and emails, trying to focus on something, anything, that wasn't her. But no matter how much I worked, no matter how late I stayed, I couldn't escape the thought that she was out there, living her own life without me, sharing moments with someone else that should have been ours. It was around this time that I started having those quiet conversations with myself, the ones that happened in the early hours of the morning when sleep wouldn't come. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, asking myself what I was doing, why I was still there, why I hadn't left yet. The answers didn't come easily. Part of me still loved her. Part of me still wanted to believe that she'd come back, that she'd realize what she was throwing away. But the rest of me knew better. She wasn't coming back. She had already checked out, and I was the only one still clinging to the idea that we could fix this. I hated myself for being so stubborn, for not admitting the truth sooner. The breaking point wasn't some big, dramatic event. It was just a moment of clarity, a realization that I was the only one holding on. One night, she came home late again. She didn't even try to explain anymore. She just walked past me, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, and disappeared into the bedroom. I sat on the couch, the TV on mute, staring at the reflection of the room in the darkened screen. That's when it hit me. I was alone, and I had been alone for a long time. She might still be living under the same roof, but she wasn't there. Not really. She hadn't been there in months. I could keep waiting, keep hoping, keep killing myself trying to hold on to something that didn't exist anymore. Or I could let go. I could start thinking about my future, my life, without her. It wasn't an easy decision. I didn't wake up the next morning feeling liberated or free. I felt numb, like I was walking through fog. But I knew that numbness was better than the constant ache I'd been living with. I knew it was time to stop waiting for her to come around, to stop pretending that things could ever go back to the way they were. It was time to start thinking about what I wanted, about what would make me happy. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a life without her. It wasn't a picture I liked at first. It felt empty, lonely. But as the days went on, I started to see it differently. Without her, I could start over. I could find myself again, rebuild a life that wasn't defined by her choices, her lies, her betrayal. I still didn't confront her. I wasn't ready for that yet. But I started making small changes, steps toward my own independence. I stopped asking her where she was going, or when she'd be home. I stopped trying to make plans together, stopped pretending that we were still partners. I focused on my own work, my own projects, my own goals. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a way to take back control, to remind myself that I didn't have to keep living in the shadow of her betrayal. I wasn't sure what my next steps would be, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward, even if just a little, and maybe that's what made all the difference. I wasn't stuck anymore. I wasn't waiting for her to change, for her to come back, for her to be the woman I fell in love with. I was starting to let go, little by little. It hurt. God, it hurt. But it also felt like the beginning of something new. Something that was mine. That night felt different from the rest. I can't explain it exactly. Maybe it was the way the house was so unnaturally quiet. Or maybe it was the weight in the air, the kind that makes your chest tighten without you even realizing it. Whatever it was, I knew something was coming. I sat at the edge of the bed, hands clasped tightly in my lap, staring down at the worn hardwood floor. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a streetlight filtering through the blinds. I could hear the faint hum of a car passing outside, the distant muffled voices of neighbors chatting on their front porch. But nothing from her. Nothing at all. She was out again, and hadn't bothered to say where she was going, or when she'd be back. I was used to it by now, but this time, it hit differently. I got up and started pacing. The creak of the floorboards the only sound in the room. My mind raced with every step. I couldn't stop picturing the moments we used to share, back when things were simple. The nights we stayed up late, laughing about stupid things, making plans for a future that seemed so promising. Those memories felt like they belonged to another life. A life that no longer existed. I tried to push them out of my head, but they clung to me like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. I walked over to the window and looked out at the street below. The faint glow of porch lights and the gentle sway of the trees in the breeze should have been calming, but instead, it only amplified the restlessness in my chest. I didn't know where she was, who she was with, or what she was doing, but I knew it wasn't something I wanted to think about. I let out a long breath, the kind that makes your shoulders sink and your head hang just a little lower. I'd been holding on to hope for so long, hoping she'd come back, hoping we could fix whatever had gone so horribly wrong. But standing there, staring at that empty street, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before. She wasn't coming back. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that thought settle over me. It hurt in a way I didn't think it could. Not the sharp, searing pain of a fresh wound, but the dull, relentless ache that comes from realizing you've been living in denial. She had left a long time ago, long before I found the credit card statements, the emails, the receipts for dinners I never had with her. She'd been leaving, bit by bit, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. And I had let her. I had clung to the illusion that if I worked harder, if I gave more, if I just loved her enough, she'd turn around and see me again. But it didn't work that way. Love wasn't enough. Not anymore. I sat back down on the bed, my hands trembling as I rubbed my palms together. I felt the heat rising in my chest, that familiar anger I had tried so hard to keep bottled up. But I couldn't hold it in anymore. I wasn't angry at her, not entirely. I was angry at myself. Angry that I had let it get this far. Angry that I had put so much of myself into someone who didn't value it. Angry that I had been too blind, too naive, too damn hopeful, to see what was right in front of me. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to let all that rage out, but I didn't. I just sat there, staring at the floor, letting it simmer beneath the surface. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped me out of my thoughts. My heart jumped, and I felt that all too familiar knot tighten in my stomach. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was later than usual. I heard the car door close, followed by the sound of her heels clicking against the pavement. She didn't rush. She never did. Her steps were slow, deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. The front door opened, and I heard the soft rustle of her keys as she dropped them on the table. A few seconds later, the door closed with that gentle click that used to mean she was home, but now just meant she was back. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, waiting. I heard her steps on the stairs, then the creak of the hallway floorboards. She stopped just outside the bedroom door, and for a brief moment, I thought she might come in, might say something, might finally acknowledge the distance between us. But she didn't. I heard her footsteps retreat down the hall, into the guest room that had become her sanctuary. The door clicked shut, and just like that, she was gone again, even though she hadn't really gone anywhere. I stared at the closed bedroom door, the silence filling the space between us. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I wasn't going to cry, not this time. I was done shedding tears over someone who had already moved on. I had done everything I could, everything I thought was right, and it still wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. But maybe that wasn't my fault. Maybe it was just the way things were. People change. Love fades. Promises break. I couldn't change that. No matter how much I wanted to. All I could do now was figure out how to move forward. I leaned back against the headboard, closing my eyes as I let out a long, steady breath. The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the streetlight outside. It felt like the end of something, a chapter closing. I didn't know what came next, didn't know how I was supposed to pick up the pieces and start over. But I knew I had to try. I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep waiting for her to come back, couldn't keep pretending that everything would somehow fix itself. It wouldn't. And as much as it hurt to admit it, I had to let go. The thought scared me. I didn't know who I was without her. I didn't know what my life looked like without the person I'd built it around. But as I sat there in the quiet, I realized that maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time to find out. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for her to change, and start focusing on myself. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't even have most of them. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not hope that she'd come back, but hope that I'd be okay even if she didn't. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to get me through the night. I couldn't keep living like that. The silence, the distance, the nights where we barely spoke, it was eating me alive. I'd always thought of myself as someone who could handle pressure, someone who could endure, but this was something else. Every time she walked past me without a word, every time I heard her phone buzz, and saw her hide the screen, it felt like a knife twisting deeper into my gut. I knew what was happening, even if I didn't have all the proof. The signs were there. They'd been there for months, maybe longer, and I'd been too blind or maybe just too stubborn to face them. I remember one night in particular, a Tuesday, nothing special about it. She came home late, as usual, but this time I couldn't just let it slide. I tried to stay calm, to ask her where she'd been. I told myself I wouldn't get angry, wouldn't push too hard. But as soon as I asked, she turned defensive. "I was with friends," she said, brushing past me. "Why do you always have to ask?" Her tone was sharp, her body language cold, and I felt the words catch in my throat. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But the way she avoided my eyes, the way she wouldn't even stop to look at me, it said everything. I stood there in the hallway, watching her disappear into the bedroom, and I knew she wasn't mine anymore. That night, I lay in bed next to her, staring at the ceiling. I could hear her breathing, soft and steady, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't understand it. How could she just close her eyes and sleep, knowing what she was doing? How could she lie there so calmly while I felt like I was coming apart at the seams? I wanted to reach over, to shake her awake, to demand answers. But I didn't. I just lay there, feeling the emptiness grow, wondering how long it had been like this. When did I stop being the person she turned to? When did I become the man she walked away from? I didn't have any answers, only questions that echoed in the dark. The next morning, I tried again. I made her coffee, just the way she liked it, and set it on the counter. When she walked into the kitchen, I smiled, trying to keep things normal. "Morning," I said, my voice sounding more cheerful than I felt. She barely looked at me. "Morning," she replied, grabbing her mug and scrolling through her phone. I wanted to ask her about last night, to try one more time to get her to talk. But the way she stood there, so distant, so detached, it stopped me. I couldn't do it. I couldn't force her to care. I just nodded and went back to my own coffee, sipping it in silence. As the days went on, I started to feel like I was disappearing. It wasn't just that she was pulling away, it was that I was losing myself in the process. I stopped going out, stopped seeing friends, stopped doing the things I used to enjoy. My world had shrunk down to the walls of that house, and the growing void between us. I'd come home from work and sit in the living room, staring at the TV, without really watching it, waiting for her to come back, and when she did, it was always the same. A quick hello, a vague excuse, and then she'd retreat to another room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out, even if just for a little while. I grabbed my jacket and went for a walk, the cool evening air hitting me like a splash of cold water. I walked for miles, through quiet neighborhoods and empty streets, just trying to clear my head. I thought about the man I used to be, the man she used to love. I thought about the plans we'd made, the dreams we'd shared, and I thought about how far we'd drifted from that, how impossible it seemed to ever get back there. By the time I made it home, my feet were sore and my hands were freezing, but my mind felt a little clearer. I knew I couldn't keep waiting for her to change. I couldn't keep hoping she'd come back to me. I had to figure out what to do next, how to move on. The problem was, I didn't know how. I'd built my life around her, around us. Every decision I'd made, every choice, had been for our future. And now, there was no us anymore. I felt lost, like a ship without a rudder, drifting aimlessly. But even as I struggled to find my footing, a part of me started to understand something important. I couldn't keep blaming her for everything. Yes, she'd lied. Yes, she'd betrayed me. But I was the one who'd stayed, the one who'd let it go on for so long. I had ignored the warning signs, made excuses, and allowed myself to become a victim. If I wanted to move forward, I had to take responsibility for my own choices. I started small. I cleaned out the spare room, turning it into an office. I went through old boxes, sorting through the things I wanted to keep and the things I was ready to let go of. It felt strange, almost like preparing for a life without her, but it also felt necessary. I needed space, physical space, emotional space to figure out who I was again. I began spending more time on hobbies I'd abandoned, reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in years. I didn't tell them what was going on. I wasn't ready for that. But just being around people who cared about me, who saw me, reminded me that I wasn't invisible. The hardest part was accepting that I couldn't fix this on my own. No matter how much I wanted to, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make her love me again. I couldn't turn back time and undo the choices she'd made. All I could do was take one step at a time, rebuilding my life piece by piece. It was slow, painful work, but it was better than standing still. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. I thought the hardest part was making the decision to leave her. In some ways, it was. But what came after facing the emptiness, rebuilding my life from the ground up, that was harder. When I walked out of that house for the last time, I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief because I was finally done pretending, finally done clinging to a relationship that had died long before I admitted it. Fear because I didn't know who I was without her. For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in being her husband, in trying to make her happy. Now I had to figure out what came next. The first few weeks were the worst. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be her, asking me to come back. She never did. I should have known she wouldn't, but a part of me still hoped she might. Instead, the calls were from friends and family, people who'd heard the news and wanted to check on me. I didn't have much to say to them. I'm fine, I'd tell them, even though I wasn't. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling, didn't know how to put into words the strange combination of heartbreak and freedom that had taken hold of me. I spent a lot of time alone in those early days. The apartment I'd moved into was small, sparsely furnished, and eerily quiet. I'd sit in the living room, staring at the walls, trying to figure out what to do with myself. I didn't miss her so much as I missed the idea of her, the person I thought she was. I missed the version of us that existed before everything fell apart. But when I really stopped to think about it, I realized that version had been gone for a long time. We hadn't been happy in years. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. One night, I went for a walk through the city, trying to clear my head. The streets were busy, full of people laughing, talking, living their lives. I felt like an outsider, like I was standing still while the world moved on without me. I stopped at a bar, ordered a drink, and sat alone at a corner table. The bartender glanced my way a couple of times, probably wondering if I was waiting for someone. I wasn't. I just needed to be somewhere that wasn't my apartment, somewhere with noise and people and the hum of life. Sitting there, sipping my whiskey, I realized I hadn't laughed in weeks. I hadn't even smiled. I made a mental note to change that. The next morning, I called an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. We met for coffee, and it was the first time in a long time that I felt like myself again. He asked how I was doing, and for once, I told the truth. I told him about the separation, about how lost I felt, about how I was trying to figure out what my life looked like now. He didn't offer any advice, didn't try to fix it. He just listened. And that was enough. By the time we said goodbye, I felt lighter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I started reaching out to other friends, people I'd lost touch with over the years. I went to baseball games, grabbed drinks after work, joined a rec league basketball team. I wasn't great at it. I hadn't played in years, but it felt good to move, to run, to focus on something other than my own thoughts. I started going to the gym again, something I'd stopped doing when my marriage began to crumble. At first, it was just a way to pass the time, to fill the hours that used to be spent waiting for her to come home. But over time, it became more than that. It became a way to reclaim my body, my strength, my confidence. I was starting to feel like myself again, one step at a time. Work became a refuge, too. I threw myself into my projects, taking on new challenges, learning new skills. My colleagues noticed the change. "You're like a new man," one of them said after a big presentation. I wasn't sure if that was true, but I was trying. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I cared about what I was doing. I was building something for myself, something that wasn't tied to her. It felt good to have a purpose again. But it wasn't all progress. There were still nights when the loneliness hit me like a freight train, when I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. There were still moments when I'd see something that reminded me of her, a restaurant we used to go to, a song we used to dance to, and I'd feel that old familiar ache. It would have been easy to fall back into old patterns, to let the sadness take over. But I didn't. I couldn't. I'd made it this far, and I wasn't about to let myself slide back. One day, I came across a box of old photos in my closet. I hesitated before opening it, knowing it would hurt to see her face again. But something told me I needed to confront it. I sat on the floor, the box in front of me, and slowly flipped through the pictures. There we were on our wedding day, smiling and full of hope. There we were on our first trip to the coast, standing on the pier with the wind in our hair. There we were at Christmas, surrounded by family, laughing at something I can't even remember now. I stared at those pictures for a long time, letting the memories wash over me. And then I put them back in the box and closed the lid. They were a part of my past, but they didn't have to define my future. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was small at first, just a flicker. But it grew. I began to see that this wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of a new chapter. I could choose how to write it. I could choose who I wanted to be, what I wanted my life to look like. It wasn't going to be easy. There would still be hard days, still be moments of doubt. But I knew now that I could get through them. I knew that I had the strength to keep going. Looking back, I don't think I would have believed it if someone had told me I'd come out of this stronger, more sure of myself. At the time, all I could see was the pain, the loss, the emptiness. But now, I see that those things were just the beginning. They were the foundation I needed to build something new, something better. I'm not the man I was before, and I'm not the man I'll be tomorrow. But I'm moving forward, and that's enough. This story doesn't end the way you think. After everything, her betrayal, my heartbreak, there's still one last twist that will leave you speechless. What would you do if your life was turned upside down like mine? Would you let her get away with it, or would you fight back? Comment below and tell me what you think. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because trust me, this isn't over yet. Sometimes, you have to lose everything you thought defined you to realize who you truly are. Walking away from her wasn't just the end of our marriage, it was the start of my life. In that painful moment, I learned the value of self-respect, of standing up for myself when the world felt like it was falling apart. It's a lesson I wish I'd learned sooner. Love yourself enough to walk away from what no longer serves you. To anyone feeling stuck, hear me, your happiness and worth are not tied to someone else's approval. Find your own strength, and don't look back.